Welcome to the Bloop Animation course in MoHo Animation. I'm David Schuttenhelm and I'll be your instructor. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a little background on MoHo itself. MoHo, formerly known as Anime Studio, is a 2D animation software made by Smith Micro. MoHo's main selling point is its ability to easily build and animate with rigged puppet characters. Its particular balance of ease of use and powerful features makes it a popular option for hobbyists, and while it's not an industry standard yet, it has been used on some major productions. Most notably, Cartoon Saloon used MoHo to create their Oscar-nominated feature films, Song of the Sea and The Breadwinner. Now, MoHo was originally created by a studio called Lost Marble, but was bought by Smith Micro and renamed Anime Studio. They kept that name all the way through version 11, but then for version 12, they rebranded back to MoHo and gave it a major interface overhaul that was a big improvement. They're currently on MoHo 13, which is what we'll be using for this course. Now there are two versions of MoHo, MoHo Pro and MoHo Debut. I highly recommend MoHo Pro. This chart from the MoHo Animation site shows you the differences between the Pro and Debut versions. The key features that I think make the Pro version worth the upgrade are Smart Bones and Smart Warp. A big part of our lessons on rigging characters will focus on the powerful ways you can enhance your character rigs with these features. There's also things like size limits and 3D object support that make Pro much better suited for doing serious animation work. For those reasons, we'll be using MoHo Pro 13 for this course. So let's get started and look at where you can download MoHo and set up your new installation. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there. So just in case you don't already have MoHo, let's look at where you can download it and set it up to get started. The site you want to go to is mohoanimation.com. This is the homepage for official MoHo content from Smith Micro. Now for this course, you want MoHo Pro. We can just go to the overview. And then here you can either buy MoHo Pro or download a 30-day free trial. Now before you pay for MoHo, look at the Education tab. If you're a student, you can get a 40% discount, so definitely take advantage of that if you're able to. Also, while we're here on the site, there is some free MoHo assets you can download. There's a bunch of example art assets and character rigs that you can use in your animations. You can come back and explore these later. For now, let's get MoHo up and running. Once you download and install MoHo on your system, the first time you launch it, you're going to get met with this window asking if you want to choose a location for your custom content folder. Your custom content folder is a place where MoHo will store things like custom brushes, palettes, custom keyboard shortcuts, and any characters or artwork you saved to the library so you can reuse them in other projects. To set this up, just click Choose, and I'm going to make a new folder in my Documents directory. Then click Choose again, and then it will proceed with opening the application. So when you first launch MoHo, you'll get this splash screen. This just links to the resources on the Smith Micro site we already looked at, so I'm going to click Don't Show This Again. You might find that it opens one of their demo projects by default. Once you know a little more, these are actually really nice to look at for examples of how different effects can be achieved in MoHo. But at this point, they're probably a little advanced, so let's change what happens when we start up. To do that, we need to go to the main preferences, which on Mac are under MoHo, Preferences. Then on the General tab, here I'll change the Startup File dropdown to No Document. So now it won't open anything when the program starts. Now we've got to create a new project of our own. We'll look at doing that in the next video. I'll see you there. So now that we've got MoHo up and running, let's look at how we create a new project. We just go to File, New, and it automatically creates a new document for us. Now this is just going to be the default settings for the project, so let's make sure it actually has the settings that we want by going to File, Project Settings. So the most important thing to set right from the start is the resolution. You have a list of options here on the drop-down. I'll choose 1080p, or you can put in custom dimensions here if you want. 24 is good for the frame rate. And if you know how long you want your scene to be, you can specify the start and end frame here, but you can always change this later too. Next, there's the background color. This is what will show up as the background when you export if you don't have background artwork of your own covering the stage. Then there are depth of field options here. This is only relevant if you're going to build your scene with 3D depth. With this on, you can have a certain level of depth in focus, but have layers of artwork in the background or foreground blurred based on their distance from the camera. The focus distance is the distance from the camera that will be in focus, and focus range is how wide that level of focus is. Max blur radius is how blurry the out of focus parts of the scene can be. You might want to just build your scene first and then come back and set these so you have a better sense of what the values should be. Then over here you have render style settings. You can get an idea of how these affect things based on the preview down here. You can try these out, but I recommend not even bothering with these because they don't give you a lot of control. Now let's come down here and look at these settings. Sort layers by depth is again if you're building a scene in 3D. So say if you have a layer that's in your background and you push it farther away from the camera along the Z-axis, with this checked, that layer would automatically get moved down to the bottom of your layer stack in the Layers panel. Sort by true distance means it will base the sorting on the origin point of the layer rather than the contents. That will make more sense when we get into the 3D features. I'll just leave both of these off for now. Next, there's anti-aliasing. This smooths out the little jagged stair-step pixels that show up along the edges of shapes. You probably want this on. Noise grain will add a film grain effect to your scene. How strong it is depends on this value. And pixelation will run a pixelation effect on your scene when it renders. Stereo rendering actually gives you the option to render a 3D movie, either to watch with red and blue 3D glasses or on a VR headset. So when it renders a 3D movie, it renders one view for each eye, and eye separation changes the amount of distance between the two views that it renders. That's obviously a very special case, and again, it's only relevant if you're actually building your scene in 3D. Then there's extra SWF frame. This would only be needed if you're going to export in a Flash SWF format, but you probably won't be doing that in this day and age, so I'm going to leave that off. So then once we have our settings the way we want them, we can come down and click the Save as Defaults button. Now, whenever we use File New, it will make a document like this one. Now I'm going to save the project file. I'll just put it in the MoHo content folder we created. So strictly speaking, that's all we need to get started, but there's one more important feature that you might want to use to keep your project organized. Come up to File, New Workspace. Now, a workspace is just a series of folders on your hard drive to store all the files you plan to use for your project. There are 4 default choices on the drop-down. Let's look at Simple. And here in the preview, you can see the folders it's going to create. There can also be subfolders within these. If you check this box, it will also create a new blank MoHo project along with the folders. Let's hit OK, and I'll have it create this workspace in the same folder where I saved my project file. Now notice that we're actually in a new MoHo project, the one that I just created along with the workspace. And if we take a look at the project settings, we can see that it did in fact create it with the defaults that we set. And if we look in the MoHo content folder where I saved it, we can see that we do in fact have the file structure from the workspace that we chose. Now, if you want to create your own custom workspace with just the folders you want, that's one of the things you can store in the custom content folder. To get there easily, we can just go to File, Open Custom Content folder. And then at the bottom, we have Workspace Templates. And you'll see these are the 4 templates that we saw before. All you have to do is make a folder here with the name you want for your template, and then make all the folders inside that you want your workspace to have. For example, I could copy the Sequences workspace and rename it Episodes, and then rename the folders inside to reflect that. Then if I go back to MoHo and go to set up a new workspace, Episodes is available on the dropdown. So Workspaces is a great way to make sure you're being consistent with how you organize all your files. Next, now that we have a project, we're going to run down all of the key elements of the interface here. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there. So now that our project is up and running, let's get familiar with the MoHo interface. It might seem strange how things work in MoHo at first, so let's do a quick rundown of the key panels and toolbars so we know what we're looking at. I've got one of the startup demo projects open, so we have some example content to look at. First, the main thing is the stage in the middle here. This is where you'll draw your artwork and see your animation. There's some key things to understand along the bottom that will be important later. You have controls for playing back the animation and navigating it. And here you can mute or enable the audio during playback. And these options here let you have multiple views of your stage at the same time. This is mostly important when you're working in 3D. We'll look at that later. Then, very important to know about is the options here to show curves or not. When you're working with vector artwork on a vector layer, which we'll be doing a lot, this controls whether you can see the control points and curves that define a line or shape. Then, next to that is the display quality drop-down list. This controls what effects and visuals get rendered live here in the stage view. Ideally, you'll be able to keep this on high so that you can get a better idea of what your final scene will look like when you export. But if your computer is getting sluggish, especially when playing back your animation, you might need to come in here and turn some features off. Now, no matter how high you have the display quality settings, your stage view isn't going to be totally accurate. To see what a particular frame will look like in your final animation, you can go up to File, Preview, or just press Command or Control R, depending on if you're on Mac or PC. Then that will render the frame in its final state the way it will appear when you export the animation. Next, let's look at the Layers panel over here. This is where you manage all the individual elements that make up the scene. There are many different layer types that you can add that each bring their own functionality. We'll go over the different types of layers in another video. But something important to notice is that based on the layer type you have selected, the options over here in the Tools panel will change. This is because different layers work in totally different ways. For example, on an image layer, you'll have bitmap drawing tools, but if you have a vector layer selected, you'll have a bunch of vector drawing tools. And this is very important too. If you have the timeline on frame 0, you'll have more tools available. Frame 0 is where you want to create all your artwork. If you're past 0, you're in the middle of the animation and you're more limited in what you can change on the fly about your layers. Now, there are some tools that remain regardless of the layer type. These tools under the layer label are for moving and working with the layers themselves rather than the contents of the layers. We'll look at what that means later. Then there's the tools under Camera. Every scene has a virtual camera that can be modified with these tools. Notice the purple frame here. That's the bounds of what the camera is seeing. That's important for telling the difference between changing the camera with the camera tools and changing your workspace view with the workspace tools. These just change the view of your scene within the program to make it easier to see what you're doing, whereas the camera tools change what is actually going to be visible in the final animation. Now I want to reset this, which brings us up here to the Tool Settings toolbar. This will be different depending on what tool you have selected. There's a lot of important functionality up here. And also, just under that toolbar, there's a row of text that will give you important tips on how to use a tool, like what modifier keys like Alt or Command do. Now, when you're using any tool that creates artwork, the Style panel will be important. This is where you control things like your colors, your line width, your brush shape, and you can even add special effects. There's a lot of functionality in this panel that we'll go over in depth later. Next, down here is the timeline. This is where you control how the motion of your character and other artwork plays out. If I find a layer that has animation on it, you'll see there are keyframes for each property like position or rotation that are being animated over time. We'll of course be going over the timeline in depth and spending a lot of time here as we create our animation. Next, I wanted to point out one panel that isn't visible by default, but can be accessed with this button here. This is the library. This is for accessing artwork and assets you want to be able to reuse in different scenes. You'll see here is the custom content folder we set up before. There's no content in there yet, but below that, in the factory content library, you can see examples of the kind of things you might want to keep in the library, like props or sounds. You can just drag one of these over and add it to your scene. We'll look at how to save something you've made in the library later. I'll just use Command-Z to undo that. Lastly, there are a few additional panels you might need access to in specific situations. All the additional panels can be found up here in the Window menu. Like for example, let's look at Keyframe window. Now currently it's a free-floating window, but any of these additional panels can also be docked as part of the regular interface. You just go back to the Window menu and go to Docking, and here you can check or uncheck whether that panel should appear free-floating or docked in position on the regular interface. So that's our overview of our key panels and toolbars. Next, we're going to take a deeper look at the Layers panel and the different layer types. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to look at the important features of the Layers panel and go over some of the important layer types that we'll use over the rest of the course. To add a new layer, you would click this Add Layer button to get a drop-down where you can select the type of layer you want to add. Now these first two, vector and image, are the main types of layers that you would create actual artwork on. Let's start with a vector layer. On vector layers, you use the vector drawing tools to create lines and shapes that are defined by precise points and curves. Vector artwork has a lot of upsides. You can modify the points and curves as much as you want, and even animate changes in shapes without degrading the quality of the edge. And it's also resolution independent, meaning it can be scaled up and down or zoomed in and out without ever getting blurry or pixelated. Vector art also takes up less memory and makes file sizes smaller. We're mainly going to be building our characters out of vector art. Next, let's try adding an image layer. That gives us this window. So first of all, if you already have an image that you want to import and use in your project, you could click Browse File and find it, and that would make this new layer that image. But in this case, let's create a blank layer that we can draw on here in MoHo. Unlike a vector layer, an image layer is resolution dependent because the content on the image is made up of pixels. So we need to specify the resolution we want this layer to be to make sure we have enough pixels to make a clear image. You'll want your image layers to be at least as big as the output resolution of your animation. But if you're going to need to scale up or zoom the camera in on your artwork, you'll want to be even higher in resolution so it doesn't look pixelated. You can also specify width and height by hand over here. And you'll typically want the background to be transparent unless this is going to be the base background layer or something. And finally, to stay organized, remember you can give your layer a name up here. Then click Create. Then you can use the brush tool and the various brush types here in the toolbar to paint on the image layer. We'll come back to image layers when we talk about doing hand-drawn animation later. You can also import a sequence of images. So suppose you already had a series of frames of animation prepared that you want to use in your project. You would go to Add Layer and Add Image Sequence. Then browse and find your images, select them all and click Open. Then it will add them all as a single layer. And down on the timeline, these triangles indicate where the sequence starts and stops. You can switch to the Sequencer tab to get a better view if you need to move it around. I'm just going to move this layer and zoom in so we can see it better. By default, each image will be displayed for one frame. If you want to change that, you can double-click on the layer and go to the Image tab where we have a bunch of options. Movie FPS lets us change the frame rate of the image sequence. It defaults to 24, the same as our project, but let's change it to 12 and hit Apply. Now you can see the image sequence lasts twice as long because each image is being displayed for 2 frames. Now currently when the image sequence finishes, the layer just ends, but if you wanted it to hold on the last frame, you could check Persist Last Frame and then hit Apply. Then when we go past the end of our image sequence, that last frame is still displayed. But in the case of this fire animation, a better idea is probably to click Loop Movie indefinitely. Then the image sequence will continue to cycle for the whole length of the timeline. Now this sequence looks weird during playback because it's not rendering any of the pixels that have transparency. It will look normal when it gets exported though. The next option under our Add Layer dropdown is Group. A group is just a folder that you can drag other layers into. This lets you keep your layers organized, and you can collapse a group so the layers don't take up so much space. You can also use all the layer transformations and animation tools on a group, and it will change everything nested inside it at the same time. Also, as a quick tip, if you already have layers you know you want to put in a group, you can select them all and add a group using Group with Selection, and those layers will automatically get put in the new group. Now, the next series of options on the layer dropdown are basically types of groups that have special functionality. For example, if you add a bone layer, this is for creating a character that's rigged with bones. You would typically have all the artwork for your character nested inside it, and then on the top level bone group, this is where you would add the bones you're going to use to rig and animate the character. You then need to do a little bit of work to make sure the right bone is affecting the right part of the artwork, but then you're able to use the bones to control the motion of the artwork inside the bone group. We'll look at bones a lot in later lessons. Next, a switch is a special group for cases where you have a set of images and you want to only show one of them at a time. You can switch between them over the course of your animation by either right-clicking on the group and selecting a layer, or using the Switch Selection panel under the Window menu. You'll see how we use switches as part of our character rigs later. Then the next option on our new layer dropdown is Frame by Frame. This is how you would set up the ability to do hand-drawn frame-by-frame animation. When you try to add a frame-by-frame group, it's going to ask if you want to use vector layers or image layers to draw the frames of your animation. Let's just do vector layers for now. Now we have what's basically a group with our first frame in it ready to go. A frame-by-frame group works basically just like a switch, except it gives us the added functionality down here on the timeline to add, delete, and duplicate new frames. This lets us easily create new drawings as we move along the timeline to create the timing we want for our drawings. We'll have a whole lesson on doing frame-by-frame animation later. The next set of layer types have more specialized purposes. For example, particle is a cool, easy way to make a particle effect. It makes a group, and then we need at least one layer inside it, and we'll just make a simple circle on it, and this circle will be our particle. Then on the settings for the particle group, there's a tab for particle. And based on these settings, the particle layer automatically spawns and animates copies of the layer inside the group. If you put multiple layers in the folder, it spawns copies of all the layers in it as particles in turn. This is a very versatile feature. Depending what you use for the particle and the settings, you can use this to make all kinds of things. like smoke or snow or speed lines. Then the next type of layer you can add is a note. This is just a piece of text you can place in the scene to leave instructions for team members or reminders for yourself. The nice feature of notes is that they show up in the stage but won't be visible when you render, so you won't have to worry about hiding them when you're ready to export. Next, you can also add an audio track. You just need to browse for an audio file. Then you'll see the waveform show up on the timeline. And on the sequencer tab, you can control its position in time. Then, a patch is a special type of layer we'll use when rigging. In cases where you have parts of the body made up of two layers, you can select one of the layers and add a patch, and target it at the other part. Then, if you position the patch, it will automatically disguise the stroke so that the layers look like they're connected. If you hide the original layers, you can see the actual patch itself that it's generating on the fly. So that's a very handy feature. Next is a text layer. When you create a new text layer, it automatically brings up the layer settings and the text tab, which is where you'll actually enter the text and do all the formatting. You can even add a word balloon to your text down here. And once you have the text layer created, you would position it with the Transform Layer tool. The last type of layer you can add is a 3D object. If you add this, it's going to ask you to browse for a 3D file, specifically an OBJ file. Then click Open. And now that 3D model appears in the scene. This is where being able to have multiple views is helpful. In this view, we can use this tool to rotate our view and get a better view of the model, and use the Layer Transform tools to position and scale and rotate the model to make it look how we want over here in the camera view. So that's the final layer type. Now that we know all the different types of layers that might go in the layer panel, we need to go over some important features of the layers panel itself and the key ways you'll work with layers. We'll cover that in the next videos. I'll see you there. So now that we know a little bit about the kinds of layers that go in the layers palette, let's look at the settings we have here on the palette itself. I have one of the MoHo demo projects open because they're a good example of how complex a MoHo project can get. So far, all we've really looked at is the Add Layer button here, but let's take a look at the buttons next to it. First of all, I'm going to use the layer visibility setting here to hide everything except one layer so we can focus on it. So the button next to Add Layer is Duplicate Layer. This takes whatever layer or group you have selected and makes a copy of it. I'll just move that layer over so we can see it. Next, there's the Reference Layer button, which is similar but different in an important way. This will make a copy of the selected layer. I'll move it so we can see it. But in this case, the layer is still referencing the original. You can see the original gets this red dot when I have the reference layer selected. So that means any change I make to the original layer will show up in the reference copy as well. If you ever want to break the reference, you can right-click and choose Break Layer Reference, and now it's just a regular duplicate. And of course, we can use the Delete button to delete layers. Now, something important to note about duplicate and reference is that they work on whole groups as well as layers. For a good example, let's find the character here. Now, this is a complex character made up of a bunch of layers rigged with lots of bones. But if we go to the main group, we can create a reference. And we have a copy of the character complete with all the animation that's already on it. Now, something key to know about animation that's referenced is if we alter the animation in the original, it updates the reference. But if you change the animation in the reference, it won't affect the original. So you can customize the animation in a reference. If I want to get it back to how it was, I go to the main character layer with the bones, which was what I changed. Then I right-click and choose Sync All Channels to Original. So that just reset all the channels to match the original, including its position. So let me move that again. And there you can see it's back in sync. While we're talking about channels, let's look at this column here. These boxes enable the timeline visibility for a layer. So normally the way the timeline works is it only shows the animation channels for the layer you have selected. But there are times when you may want to be able to see keyframes you've set on a different layer. If you enable timeline visibility in the Layers palette, that layer's channel will stay visible in the timeline even if you have something else selected. You see it's labeled there. But if you want to make it even easier to tell your layers apart, you can assign them different colors over here on the layer palette. You can assign the layer a color by clicking on the square in this color column. That gives the layer a color in the Layers palette and in the timeline when you have its channel visibility on. So those are the columns that are visible by default, but if you right-click, there are some other columns you can turn on if you want. You can turn on comments, which are text notes that you can leave for yourself or team members to understand what the layer is for. There's also tags, which are terms that you can attach to a layer to use to search for it later. We'll look at searching in a second. The last here is kind, which just spells out for you what kind of layer it is. So you can enable or disable whatever columns you need. When you have a column enabled, you can actually sort the layer stack using that column. By default, layers are arranged by the order they're stacked visually on the stage. But if you click this arrow in the corner, you're able to click the column names to sort based on that column. So sorting might help you track down the layer you're looking for, but what's really going to be helpful is filtering, which is like searching. You choose what you want to search for on this drop-down here. For example, we could search for kind contains, and then type in bone, and it will only show bone layers. So you can do a search using any of these characteristics, including tags or comments, which you can add to layers yourself if you need a really specific way to find a layer. The next thing to know about is layer comps. Layer comps are basically a way to save the visibility state of a set of layers. So say I hide everything and I just want to have the background visible. I can define this state as a new layer comp with this button here and click New Layer Comp and name it. Then I can also hide or show all layers again from this menu. Then if I ever need to go back to just the background layers, I go to the Layer Comps menu, and then you have a choice between Show Layer Comp or Expose Layer Comp. Show Layer Comp will turn on visibility for the layers. Expose Layer Comp will turn on the visibility for those layers and turn everything else off. So that's what I want in this case. Notice you can also do the same with timeline visibility too. The last thing I want to point out is the layer setting window. You can get to that either with this button here or just by double-clicking a layer. There's a lot of settings here that we'll cover as they come up, but you'll see a lot of things we already covered, like the layer color and tags and comments and the layer name itself. You'll also have different tabs up here depending on the layer type with a ton of extra settings. I just wanted to point this out because MoHo puts a lot of functionality in here, more than you would find in other programs. So if you're ever trying to figure out how to do something, don't forget to check the layer settings to see what options you have here. The only thing I really want to point out at this point is this visibility checkmark. This is not the same thing as the layer visibility here on the palette. It's easy to see the difference if we switch the timeline to the sequencer view and come out a little ways on the timeline. So look at this layer. If I hit the eyeball, the whole layer goes away. But if I change the visibility in the layer settings and hit apply, It just hides the layer's contents starting at that point on the timeline. I can even go later and turn visibility back on in the middle of the animation. So just keep those two kinds of visibility straight, and don't use one when you mean the other. So that's it for the layer palette. Next, we're going to quickly cover the layer tools in the tools palette. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there. So while we're talking about layers, we should make sure we know some of the cool things we can do with them. First, let's run through the tools in the Tools panel under the Layers label. An important thing to note is that these can be used on vector and image layers as well as on groups, in which case it will change everything inside the group at once. We've already seen a little bit how to use the Transform Layer tool. You can use this to move, scale, or rotate a layer. Always keep in mind that this is just transforming the layer itself, not the drawings on the layer. The position, scale, and angle can always be reset by these controls up here, and you can enter values by hand if you want. Before you start using the Transform tool, you might want to make use of the next tool, the Set Origin tool. You use this to reposition the origin point to the position that makes the most sense for the drawing. This is important because when you rotate or scale, it's going to be centered around the origin point. That's also important if you use this tool, the Rotate Layer XY, which rotates the layer in 3D around both the X and Y axis, centered on the origin point. The last way you might want to transform a layer is to shear it using the Shear tool. Now, all of the transformations you do with these tools can be animated. For example, I'm going to take the Layer Transform tool, and I'm just going to move the shape to a starting point. Then I'm going to come out to frame 1 and click, and that automatically creates a keyframe for the Layer Translation property. Then I'm going to come out later on the timeline and move the shape, and that automatically creates another keyframe and animates between them. If you want to change the path that the layer takes as it animates, that's what this tool here is for, the Follow Path tool. You start on a fresh layer without animation on it. So I'm just going to select all the keyframes we made and delete them. And I need to reset the position of the layer. Then on another vector layer, I'll name it Path. I'll draw a path for the layer to follow. I'll just use the Freehand tool and make sure the stroke is off so it will be invisible. Then on the layer you want to follow the path, select the Follow Path tool, and it makes any invisible paths visible, so we can click on the path where we want to set our starting point. Then we come out later on the timeline and click where we want the layer to end up at this point. And now the layer follows the path. One last thing to know if you want to use this tool, if you go into the settings for the layer, there's an option hidden down here, Rotate to Follow Path. With this on, your layer will orient to follow the direction of the path as it moves. So let's quickly finish going through the rest of these tools. This next one is actually a really handy tool to know about, the Layer Selector tool. This is going to be an important layer when you have more complex scenes with lots of groups and layers. When you want to edit a piece of artwork, you need to have its layer selected in the Layers palette to be able to interact with that layer. But often it's hard to track down what layer is what, so with the Layer Selector tool, you can just click something on the stage and it will automatically select the layer of whatever you clicked on. Once that's selected, you can switch to another tool and edit the artwork on the layer. Next, there's the Insert Text tool, which is the same as adding a text layer like we looked at before. And lastly, there's the Eyedropper tool. What's special about this version of the eyedropper, as opposed to the ones in the Style palette, is this one, if you use it on a vector shape, it will sample all of the shape's style properties at the same time. So the fill color, the stroke width, and any effects you have applied. So if you want to reuse all the style attributes of a shape, you can easily get them all with this. Great, so that's it for the layer tools. The last very important piece of the interface to understand is the timeline. Now we've got to see a little of how it works already, but next we're going to cover it in more depth. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to look at the timeline in MoHo. Notice that the timeline has 3 different tabs for 3 different modes. We're going to start out in Channel View. One important thing to make sure you remember about the timeline in MoHo is that there is a frame 0. Even though you can see by this green arrow that the animation doesn't actually start until frame 1 and on. When you're on frame 0, MoHo is in designer mode. Everything that you do in MoHo besides actually animating should be done on frame 0. So this is where you would do all your drawing, character rigging, and scene setup. In fact, you might want to go up to the main preferences, and then the timeline tab, and turn on highlight frame 0. Then the stage will get this red highlight when you're on frame 0 in designer mode. Next, let's talk about setting keyframes on the timeline to create animation. Keyframes are placed on the timeline at a specific frame and define the state or value of some property like position, rotation, color, line thickness, basically anything. Pretty much anything you can control, you can animate with keyframes. Let's try an example. You've seen me do this a couple times. I'm going to make an animation of this shape sliding over. Here on frame 0, I'm going to use the Layer Transform tool to move the square into position for where I want it to start its animation. Then, starting on frame 1, I'm going to just click on the square to set an initial keyframe. So that automatically makes an animation channel and gives us the first keyframe. You can tell by the icon, which looks like the Layer Transform tool, that this is a channel for the translation property or position property of the currently selected layer. I'm also going to set a keyframe for the rotation of the layer because I want to animate the shape rotating while it moves. So still with the Layer Transform tool, if I come out to the corner, the tool icon changes to rotation mode, and now if I click, it adds a keyframe for rotation on its own channel. Then let's come out later on the timeline, and we're going to define the end position for the shape. Let's say we want this animation to take 2 seconds. Since the frame rate we set for our project is 24 frames per second, 2 seconds would be 24 times 2 or 48. So let's find 48. By the way, you can use these buttons over here to zoom in and out on the timeline to see more or less at once. You can also see by this orange region along the top where the end of your animation will be. We can animate past that, but it won't get exported. So let's zoom in so we're roughly looking at frames 1 through 48. Then with the playhead at 48, I'll just move the shape to its new position and also rotate it. Now it will store the total amount you rotate it. So let's say I want to turn 3 times as it travels. I would just rotate it 1, 2, 3 times. Up here you can see the total degrees something has been rotated. And we can play the animation. Now it's going to keep playing for the whole movie, so let's temporarily change the endpoint of the movie to 60. And now when we play it back, it will go back to the beginning and loop shortly after the end of the move. Now after you have keyframes, you can move them around. So say you want the position change to finish before the rotation, you can just click and drag the end keyframe earlier. And if we want the shape to return back to its original position, we can select those 2 original keyframes using Command-C to copy and come out later, and Command-V to paste. Change our end frame since we're out of range now. And then when we play, the shape goes back exactly where it was. Now, let's say the whole animation is good, but everything is positioned incorrectly on the stage. Well, to fix that, we would need to adjust the position of all the keyframes by the same amount. That's what this relative keyframing setting is for. With this on, you can select keyframes, and then any change you make will get applied to all of them. So let's click the channel, and that selects all the keyframes. Then we can move the shape and it gets moved the same amount on all the other keyframes. Just make sure to turn it off when you don't want to use it. You'll also notice a checkbox for auto freeze keys. That's mostly relevant when you're animating a character rigged with bones, so I'm going to hold off on talking about that till we start animating with bones. We'll get into the nuances of how to do animation with keyframes later. Right now, I want to cover some features of the channels themselves. These are things that could be handy down the line but aren't obvious. First of all, the layer translation or position channel is a special kind of channel. Remember, the position is actually 3 different values, the X, Y, and Z coordinates. By default, they're all keyframed on the same channel. But if you want, you can right-click and choose Separate Dimensions. Then you get 3 different channels, which can be helpful if you want to make those changes at a different rate or offset them like we did with position and rotation earlier. If you don't need them separate, right-click and rejoin dimensions. In fact, if you want, you can do something similar with all channels for a layer. You can right-click and choose Consolidate Layer Channels. Then all the channels for the layer get condensed down to 1. You can still see the timing of wherever a keyframe is, you just can't see what property it's on. To separate them again, just right-click and unconsolidate layer channels. Next, you might have noticed this green dot next to each channel. This lets you double-click to mute and unmute a channel. When a channel is muted, the animation of that property will not be visible on the stage. So you can see we mute the rotation property on our first shape. That would let us focus on just the position animation. Or we could do the opposite and look at the rotation without the position animating. And one last thing about channels, remember that by default, only channels for the selected layer will be visible in the timeline, unless you check the channel visibility for the layer. Then its animated channels will be visible even when another layer is selected. This lets you reference the keyframes on another layer while you're animating the current one. Also, along the top, there are drop-downs for the default interpolation and interval. We'll cover those concepts in detail when we get to animation, but basically interpolation is the easing or the acceleration and deceleration between keyframes, and interval is a way to basically change the frame rate between keyframes. So you can specify that animation play out every single frame, every 2 frames, 3 frames, etc. The important thing to know is that these drop-downs just change the default for when you make a new keyframe. To change the values on an existing keyframe, you right-click on it and you have the easing and interval options here. You can kind of see by the spacing on the dots on the motion path how the different interpolation settings will change the speed as the shape travels. Though in this case it's a little unclear because it's going back and forth over the same path. If you want a clearer visualization of the easing between your keyframes that offers a lot of control, you can switch over to the motion graph view. This view shows the change in values on your channels with a line graph. The steeper the curve, the faster it's moving, and the less steep, the slower it moves. Now, depending on how big your value changes are, this graph might be going off the screen, or maybe be too subtle to see. To fix that, you can use the scroll wheel on your mouse to change the vertical scale of the motion graph, or you can try the auto zoom button. Also, you could specify the scale of the graph here. So if you put in 20, the graph now goes from 10 up top to -10 at the bottom. And right now we can see the center of the graph is at 0, but if we want, we can come up to this box and change that. But an easier way is to just right-click and drag, and that will let you scroll the center point up and down. Now you might run into a situation where your graph is too busy with too many curves from different properties, so you can disable those and just focus on specific curves at a time. So for example, I'll right-click and do Separate Dimensions so we see X, Y, and Z values separately. And you can see they each have separate channels. If I only want to look at one of them at a time, I can click to hide the graphs for the other ones. Eventually, we'll spend some time here on the motion graph, and you'll come to understand how powerful it is. But for now, let's go back to the channel view and keep going over these settings up top. The next option you have here is onion skinning. This lets you see faded versions of the previous and later frames for you to reference while working on the current frame. Now, enabling onion skinning by itself won't do anything. You have to make sure that you click to enable at least one marker down here on the timeline next to your playhead. You can enable markers on up to 8 frames, any ones that you want, either forward or backwards, and it will show them on the stage. On this drop down here, you have the options that control how onion skinning is displayed. You can set it to outlines to only see outlines, or you can disable the red and green color fills it puts on them. Then there's the option relative frames. With this on, the onion skin markers follow your playhead as it moves around. With it off, the markers stay where they are and it always shows those specific frames. Then there's selected layers only. If you turn this off, it's going to show onion skin views of all your layers at the same time. Then the last option is draw behind, which makes sure the onion skin views are always behind the current frame. And if you want, you can use this button to clear all enabled onion skin markers. So the last button here we haven't tried yet is the Add Marker button. This lets you add a text label to a particular frame. And you can specify whether you want it to be a document-wide marker, which will be visible on the timeline no matter what layer you have selected, or if that's unchecked, it will only be visible on that particular layer. You can move your markers, double-click to edit them, or hit delete to delete them. Now, the last view we haven't looked at in this video yet is the sequencer. This displays your timeline and all of your layers in a way that's more like how you'd find in a video editor, with each of your layers as a track on the timeline. You can move around your layers to make them start sooner or later. And if you want the contents of your layer to disappear entirely at a certain frame, you can go to the layer settings and toggle the visibility. And the track now has an end. Now, where the sequencer is really going to be most useful is for audio. So I'm going to add an audio layer and find my audio track. And you can see it adds it where I had my playhead, and I can move it around so it starts whenever I want. And if you look back on the channels view, the waveform shows up there so you can animate to the audio. By the way, notice we have a new channel and keyframes here. This is from when we changed the visibility back in the sequencer view. I'm just going to delete this keyframe here where it switches to invisible to make it visible again for the rest of the timeline. Now on the sequencer, there are a couple buttons here specifically for dealing with audio. There's the Restart Audio button. We've got to make sure we have that audio layer selected. This lets you come out past the end of your track, and then if you hit this, it will restart the audio. Then there's the Audio Level button, which lets you specify the volume level for the track at a given point. Now keep in mind, what it's actually doing is setting a keyframe for the audio level. If we go back to the channel view, you can see we've got an audio channel now, and this is the keyframe we just set. If we were to come out later in the sound, and then switch back to the sequencer, and adjust the audio level again all the way down, now when we go back to the channels view, we can see between those two keyframes, the sound is actually fading out. You can tell by the waveform. And of course, you can delete the keyframes to get the sound back how it was. Lastly, I want to point out a particularly good use for the sequencer, and that is to divide your animation into scenes. For example, in the built-in example project, Zorbatron, you see the layers are organized in a few top-level folders, which each contain a scene. Then on the sequencer, the folders are dragged out and the visibility of those scene folders is turned on or off to make it cut from one scene to the next. So that's it for the timeline, and that's it for our overview of the interface. Next, we're going to look more closely at our drawing tools. We'll do that in our next series of videos. I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to look at the vector drawing tools over here in the Tools palette. These appear when you have a vector layer selected in the Layers palette. You might be familiar with vector tools from other programs like Adobe Illustrator or Animate, but the tools here in MoHo work a little differently, so let's look more closely. This tool here is the freehand drawing tool. We're going to be taking a special look at this in a separate video along with a couple other features. For now, let's run through everything else. Before we start, it's important to note that before you start drawing, you want to make sure that the playhead of your timeline is on frame 0. It's best practice in MoHo to do all your art creation and character rigging and scene setup on frame 0. Let's start really basic with the Shape tool. Up here you have the options for the tool. Let's just do a simple rectangle for now. Also keep an eye on the messages under here for modifier keys that let you do special things with a particular tool. One thing to note right away is you can use this setting down here below your stage to turn on and off the visibility of the actual vector points and the vector path that defines the shape. I'll just leave this on so you can see better how these tools work. It's set to automatically give whatever we draw a stroke or outline, and automatically give it a fill color, assuming it's a closed shape. You can uncheck these to get just a stroke or just a fill. The colors for these are controlled over here in the Style palette, and you also control the width of the stroke here. If you want to modify these for a shape you've already drawn, you need to use the Select Shape tool to select whatever you want to change and then adjust the style settings. Also, if you have multiple shapes overlapping, you can use the Select Shape tool and then use the up and down arrow keys to change the layering of the different shapes. There's more you can do to style a shape, but we'll look at the Style palette in a separate video. Now, if you want to delete a shape, you actually don't want to use the Select Shape tool. You want to use the Transform Points tool. This will actually select the vector points that make up the shape, and then you can hit delete to delete them. More on this tool in a second. So let's say we want our shape to have a stroke, but we don't want the stroke to be a uniform thickness. We can control that using the Line Width tool. Then hold Command or Control to get the Selection tool. And then you can select the points that make up the shape and just click and drag horizontally to increase or decrease the width of the stroke. This lets you create a custom width at different points of the shape. You can select single points or multiple points and control them simultaneously. Notice up top that this change is indicated as a %. So if we wanted the stroke back to normal, we could just select all the points and set them to 100%. Then the width is back to whatever it is in the Style palette. One last thing, if you put the Line Width tool in magnet mode here, it will snap to whichever point is closest. And you control the range of the snapping effect with the magnet radius. Okay, now let's look at how we can create more complex shapes. The first thing we can do is use the Transform Points tool. This does a few things. First of all, it lets you click on shapes to move, scale, and rotate them. Or you can flip the points of the shape horizontally or vertically with these buttons. You can also click on individual points and move them. Or you can hold Command or Control to make a selection of points and move, scale, or rotate just those points. Also, if you have a shape with curves instead of sharp corners, you can use this option up here to enable and disable what are called Bezier handles. These let you more precisely change the shape of a curve. Also, if you hold Alt, you can break the handle and create a sharper turn. This other toggle here changes whether the Bezier handles are fixed or not. When this is on and you click a point to move it, only it moves. But if that's off and you move a point, the adjacent curve will flex along with it. This could be useful if you're trying to more naturally reshape something during an animation. And if you have a shape with a sharp corner and you want to make them curved, you would use the Curvature tool. You select a point and then click and drag to increase or decrease its curvature. And you can see it gets Bezier handles then. And you can also hold Alt to get a selection tool to select multiple points and change all their curvature at the same time. Then you can customize from there using the Bezier handles. And up here, you can switch points from curves to corners if you need to. So that's how you modify existing points, but what if you don't have enough control points? First of all, if you know you need a lot more control points, you can use the Select tool to select points on our shape. And then this Split button up here will add additional points halfway between the points you have selected. But if you want to manually add points in specific spots, you can use the Add Point tool and click to add points to a shape. Just be aware of whether you want to add a sharp corner or not. And you probably want your Bezier curves locked. Otherwise, adding a point will change the existing curve. You can also use the Add Points tool to draw a shape from scratch. Before we try that, make sure Auto Fill, Auto Stroke, and Auto Weld are checked. You'll see why in a second. And you can choose whether you want to draw with sharp corners or not. I'll draw with curved points. Then you can click and drag to draw a stroke. Then click the endpoint and drag again to make another segment. We can keep going and come back around to the start. And because we have the Auto Weld setting turned on, it will automatically close the shape and add the stroke and fill. If Auto Weld was off and you tried to draw a shape, it wouldn't close automatically. You could weld points manually by using the Transform Points tool. Drag the endpoint over the other and press Enter. Lastly, you can also use this tool to subdivide a shape or add interior lines. However, notice these paths don't actually have a stroke yet. So we need to use the Paint Bucket tool, set it to Add Stroke, and then it will add a stroke to those paths. So with a combination of all the tools we've looked at, you can make any shape very precisely. But what we haven't looked at yet is how to make a shape with a hole in it. Like say we wanted to make a donut shape. Let's start by drawing two circles. I'll hold Alt to expand it out from the center point and hold Shift to make it a perfect circle. So now I have two separate circle shapes, but that's not what I want. I just want to use these two circle paths on their own. So what I'll do is use the Delete Shape tool. And now I'm left with just raw paths, and we'll turn them into a new shape. I'm going to the Paint Bucket tool. We can use this to add a stroke or fill or both. I'll do both. And then click in this space here, and now we have a donut shape. So using that same technique, you could make a hole of any shape within another shape. The last tool for making a shape is the Blob brush, which just lets you paint an area, and that area will become a shape. So we've looked at various ways of making shapes. Next, let's look at the other tools we have for modifying our shapes. I'm going to draw a grid with the Shape tool so you can clearly see what these tools do. We've already looked at the main Transform Points tool for moving, scaling, and rotating, but down here we have some more. This is the Perspective tool. You click and drag to make it look like a shape has turned in perspective, either horizontally or vertically. And remember, for each of these, they work on a sub-selection of points as well as whole shapes. Next is the Shear tool, which lets you skew or tilt a shape. Then there's the Bend tool, which lets you bend a shape around a central point. Then there's the Magnet tool. This is a more organic way to distort a shape. When I click and drag, it pulls on the points within the radius of the magnet. The points nearer the center get pulled harder than those towards the edge. So assuming you have enough points on your shape, this gives a sense of stretching something soft. This can be useful when we get into animating shape changes later. Then, last on the bottom row is the Noise tool. This lets you add irregularities to a shape to make it more organic and less geometric. Let's say we wanted to make a ground plane. I'll make it a rectangle. Then select the top and use Split to add some extra points. Then select everything and use the noise tool to randomly offset the points. And then I'll use the curvature tool to round those. And there we've got a nice organic ground plane. Next, let's take a look at the Curve Profile tool. This one's pretty cool, but it's not at all obvious what it's for or how it works. The best way to explain is to show you. So I'll make a shape, then I'm going to make another path that will apply along the curve around the shape. It's best to do this on a separate layer, so I'll make a new vector layer and call it Curve Profile, so I don't get them mixed up. Then I'll use the Add Point tool to just make an invisible path. Then back to the original shape, I'll select it and grab the Curve Profile tool, and then select the curve we drew, and it gets applied all along the outline for the shape. And the connection is still live, so we can go to our Curve Profile layer and edit it, and the shape around our path gets changed as well. And if we select the main shape and go back to the Profile tool, we can adjust how often the profile gets repeated along the edge. So that's what that tool is for. Now let's look at a couple tools that you might use for a similar purpose. So here I have a face with the nose as a separate shape on its own layer, and suppose I don't want this line on the outside edge where it's supposed to be connected to the face. There are a couple tools that will help us get rid of it. I can use this tool, the Hide Edge tool. Now don't confuse this with the Delete Edge tool. The Delete Edge tool will actually remove the edge, making the shape open, so you'll lose your fill. The Hide Edge tool just hides the stroke between 2 points, so you'll still keep the fill. Now there's another way to do a similar thing that gives you a little more control. We can use the Stroke Exposure tool. If we click and drag, it changes where the stroke edge ends. You may need to edit the values up top to also change the start percentage so your stroke starts and ends in the right place. This has the advantage of not needing to end or start at a control point. And this is something that can be animated on the timeline. So say I have animated the head turning. I can animate the stroke exposure over the course of the turn so it shifts from one side of the nose to the other. Lastly, I wanted to end by looking closely at the Selection tool. I've been using this casually, but here are some important features to know that it has. First of all, by default, the Selection tool uses a rectangular marquee selection, but you can also set it to lasso mode to make it easier to select specific points without selecting others. Then we already saw that you can use the split button up here to add additional control points between the ones that you've selected. Next to that, we have the opposite, which is simplify. If you have a shape that's made up of more points than is really needed, you can try to use this feature to reduce them. Just be aware this might change the shape slightly. You need to enter a value here for how aggressive you want the reduction to be. Higher value will remove more points, but change the shape more. Let's try 20. Then select what it is you want to simplify, and the button is now active. So we click that, and it reduces our points. Next, there's the Weld Crossings option. If you have two shapes overlapping, select them and hit Weld Crossings. It will add welded control points at the intersections. Note that these are still separate shapes. I can select them separately and move them separately. They'll just weld together at those specific points. And then lastly, we'll end on one of the coolest and most unique features of the Selection tool in MoHo, and that's the ability to save a particular selection of points. So say we have this head here, and we know we're going to want to move the jaw up and down over the course of the animation. I can make a selection of the points for the chin, and then up here I give it the name Chin and click Create. Now, if I ever want to make that selection again, I can just select it from the Select Group dropdown. And that appears when you're using the other transform tools as well. That can be super useful later when we get into animation and rigging. So that's everything in the vector drawing tools except for the freehand drawing tool. We're going to look at that on its own in the next video. I'll see you there. If you're going for a more organic hand-drawn look, but still want the benefits of vector-based artwork, you'll want to learn about the freehand tool. This is a tool that lets you use a tablet or drawing screen to draw more natural pen strokes with pressure sensitivity. But if you turn on viewing vector strokes, you see these lines are still vector-based and can be modified by control points just like other vector art. By the way, to really see what your strokes are going to look like, you might want to turn on anti-aliasing in your display quality settings. If your computer can handle it, you can leave this on, but if the brush gets sluggish, just turn that off and it will perform better. To make this tool easy to use, you're going to want to understand all its settings and features. First, as always, check under the toolbar here to see how modifier keys affect the tool. In this case, if we hold Alt and drag left or right, that lets us adjust the size of the brush on the fly. That's much easier than changing the width over here in the Style palette. And also, if you hold Command or Control on Windows and click, you can delete a segment between 2 points. Next, let's look at the options on the drop-down menu here. First, you can choose whether you want pressure sensitivity on or not. You can set the line variation to none, in which case the line will be a uniform thickness like using the other vector tools. Or you can also set it to random, which will add random variation to your line width just to make it look a little more organic. Or you can have pressure sensitivity on, so the thickness is controlled by how hard you press with your tablet stylus. The width variation setting controls the range of difference that's allowed. So the maximum thickness with maximum pen pressure is whatever the width setting is set to, and the smallest you can go with lightest pressure is controlled by this width variation. 100 would let you get very small with light pressure, but 0 would basically be the same as no variation. Taper start and taper end are only really relevant if you aren't drawing with a tablet or screen with pen pressure. If you draw freehand with a mouse, this will automatically add taper to the start and end of a stroke. I am using a drawing screen, so my pen pressure is going to override this anyway. Next comes smoothing and point reduction. What you set this at is going to be very personal to you. These both control how much MoHo adjusts the lines you draw to make them smoother. Smoothing is how much MoHo smooths the line as you draw to account for pen wobble. If I turn this way up, you can see how much it's changing things as I go. I like to keep that fairly low. Then point reduction is how much MoHo will try to simplify your lines after you've finished drawing them. This is basically like running the simplify command with the selection tool, but automatic. So if I turn that all the way down and draw a stroke, you can see how many points it's made of. But if I turn that up, even to just 20, and draw a similar stroke, you can see there's fewer points. By the way, remember you may need to do a Command or Control R to do a render to judge the real smoothness of your lines and decide if extra points makes your lines look better or worse. So I'd recommend you have at least a little of smooth and point reduction turned on. Next, let's take a look at the settings out here on the toolbar. First of all, notice we have autofill and autostroke like with the other vector tools. Autostroke is what actually draws the strokes we've been looking at. Otherwise, it just makes a raw vector path. And autofill will fill the shape you draw with the fill color if you draw a closed shape. Whether your shape gets treated as open or closed is dependent on some of these other settings. There are two different weld settings here to be aware of: auto weld and weld ends. First, let's look at auto weld. If I draw a stroke and then go to draw another one that intersects with it, you can see my cursor snaps to the line I'm going to intersect with and makes a control point connecting them. Same happens if I draw all the way through. They get welded at the intersection. If auto weld is off, intersecting lines remain separate. Weld ends is like auto weld, but it only applies to endpoints of strokes. So now if I draw two lines, notice my cursor doesn't snap to the middle of the first stroke, but it will to the end point. Using this, you can build up a bigger shape with many strokes that get combined into one. And if you close the shape, it will get filled in if autofill is on. You can also make closed shapes with a single stroke if the ends get welded. Another way to make a closed shape is to check the auto close option. Then it will automatically draw a closing line between your endpoints whether they're welded or not. Check hide auto close segment, and that final closing line won't have the stroke applied to it. Now you'll also notice when auto weld is on that you have these other options, trim start and trim end. These are intended to help make your line work easier and cleaner when you have lines intersecting. So let's say I have a shape and I want to add some interior lines that intersect with the outline. Let's turn on trim start. And now the part of my line before the intersection gets trimmed away. With trim end, the opposite happens. The part after the intersection gets trimmed. And if both are enabled and I cross another line, it will trim away whichever is shorter. Also, I can draw all the way through my shape and both the start and end bit get trimmed, just leaving the portion between the two intersection points. That's a lot easier than trying to start and end your line exactly on the outline. The last setting on the toolbar is the Merge Strokes option. With this enabled, all the strokes you make will be treated as parts of the same shape. So if you select with the Select Shape tool, it highlights all the strokes and you can change their color or style setting at the same time. If you disable Merge Strokes, the strokes you draw will be their own shapes. If you re-enable Merge Strokes, it will start grouping them again, starting with the previous stroke you drew. So before we finish looking at the freehand tool, I want to take a quick look at the Styles palette, specifically the different brush settings. Just double click here where it currently says No Brush, and you can choose from one of the preset options here. Some of these are meant to make your strokes look more like natural media, and others are used to make patterns that follow your strokes. If you're interested in learning more about these brushes, we're going to cover that and the other features of the Style palette in the next video. I'll see you there. So in this video, we're going to dig into the Style palette so you're able to use it effectively and save time later on in the animation process. So we already know about setting a fill and stroke color. Let's select a shape with the Select Shape tool. By the way, to make it easier to see your styles, make sure Checked Selection is unchecked. That toggles between the checkered selection and this red outline selection. With the shape selected, we can change our selected stroke and fill colors, or uncheck these to get rid of them entirely. Another option for picking colors that we haven't looked at yet is the Swatches palette down here. Using the drop-down, you can set this to display one of these preset examples of a color palette. If you left-click within the palette, it will set the fill color, and if you right-click, it will set the stroke color. Now, all this color palette really is an image file. If you look at some of these other options, you can see a variety of ways you might use the color palette to easily get at the colors you want to use for a scene. Some of these are just photos, and some are photos that have been pixelated, while others are background illustrations for a scene. And take a look at face.png. This is basically the model sheet for a character design with the colors called out to make them easy to select. This is a great way to make use of concept art and character model sheets to make it really easy to use the right color for the right part of the character. To add your own image, just select Custom Image from the bottom and browse to your image file and open it. If you have images you know you're going to want to use as palettes frequently, go to File, open Custom Content folder, and then in the folder called Swatches, you can drop whatever images you want, and they'll appear by default in the Swatches dropdown. In addition to colors, we can also apply a brush style to the stroke if we want. These brushes are just a small PNG image file that you can see here. And then the settings down here determine how the brush lays down the image. Down here you can see a preview of what the brush will look like as you change your settings. If you want additional brushes, you can buy packs from the Smith Micro website, or if you want to make your own custom brush, you just need a starting image as a PNG file with a transparent background. Go to File, Custom Content folder, and find the Vector Brushes folder, and add your PNG file there. Then when you start MoHo, that image will appear in your brushes palette. Once you've got the brush tip in, you then need to set the settings down here for how it's going to lay down a stroke using that tip. And there are a couple ways to save these settings. If you look at the other brushes here, there's a naming scheme that will automatically set the settings when it brings in the PNG. You can just rename your file with the settings you want and restart MoHo. Or if you want a less technical way, you can just set your settings to what you want and then click Save Brush down here. Give it the name you want, and it'll save it to the same custom content folder. Then also go ahead and reload the brushes. If you look in the custom content folder, you'll see that it saves a new copy of the original PNG and this .moho brush file. The next feature of the style palette we haven't looked at yet is this effects dropdown. These are special effects you can apply to a shape as part of its style. So for example, let's try shaded effect. This gives us a bunch of settings and controls that lets us automatically put a shadow on our shape. If you ever need to change the settings for a style you've applied, press this button. Now some of these effects won't be visible on the stage. You need to do a render with Command or Control R to see what they will actually end up looking like. For example, the soft edge effect, which feathers the edges of a shape's fill. We'll need to turn off the stroke for this one. So you can't see it on the stage, but if we render the image, you can see how soft the edge really is. Next, there's the gradient effect. This is how you would apply a color gradient to a fill. You can select and delete one of the color squares to simplify your gradient, or click on the strip to add an additional square, and then you click inside these squares and use the color picker to define the colors that are on your gradient. And choose the type of gradient up here. Then it gives you this tool to position the gradient within the shape. Note that this gradient overrides whatever the color of your fill is. If we go back in the settings and enable Allow Transparency and bring down the opacity of one of the colors, then it's just going to make the shape transparent. The last one here I think you might find useful is Image Texture Effect. This lets you browse for an image file and use that in place of a fill color. Now this image is tileable, so I'll leave the fill mode on tile. You can then use these controls to position and size the image texture. Also, if you use a source image that has transparency, like this PNG, by default it will show it over top of the shape's fill color. But you can also enable through transparency, and then it will hide the fill color of the shape and only show the image texture. Now you might be wondering if there's a way to apply more than one effect. There is, but we'll look at that in just a second. So let's say you figured out a style for one shape and you want to apply it to others. Well, the first thing to point out is that these buttons down here give you the ability to copy and paste a style from one shape to another. So if we have the style we want in a shape, we just make sure we're using the Select Shape tool to select it, then hit Copy. Then if we select a different shape, we can hit Paste, and we'll have the same style. We can also hit Reset here to go back to the default style settings. So copying and pasting is nice, but there's a much more powerful way to save and apply styles. First, let's enable Advanced Mode with this checkbox. This gives you some nice extra features right away. For example, you now have the option to apply two effects at the same time to your fills. You can also apply effects to the stroke too. And you can enable or disable the round caps that automatically get added to strokes that you draw. But the real power of advanced mode is being able to save and reuse styles. Let's look at a demo of how and why you would want to do that. So here we have a basic face that's made up of a bunch of different shapes. The first thing I'm going to do is name these shapes. If you have a shape selected with the Select Shape tool, you'll have the option in the Styles palette to give it a name. It will then appear on the Shapes dropdown. This is just an easy way to select a shape without having to switch to the Select Shape tool and click on it. I'm just going to go through and name all the pieces of this face. Now, next to the Shape dropdown is the Styles dropdown. Here we can save a style. First, let's create a style for the hair. The hair is in separate parts, but we'll just work with one for now. I'm going to set the fill color, stroke color, width, and give the stroke a brush texture. Then I will come to the Styles dropdown and select New, and then give that style a name. So now that style is saved as an option in the Styles dropdown. Now the next part can be easy to miss. If I select the shape, if you look down here on the Style 1 dropdown, you see this is where that style is actually applied. So if I select the rest of the hair shapes, I can then set their Style 1 setting to the style for the hair. Now the nice thing about having the style applied in this way, as opposed to copy and pasted, is if I go up to the Styles dropdown and open the style for the hair, I can change these settings and they change on every shape the style is applied to. Also note that there are checkboxes next to the different settings. These tell the style to override the original shape settings. So say if you wanted the shapes to keep their original stroke width, we could uncheck this box. Then if there's a shape with a different stroke width, it will keep it, but have the other settings from the style applied. Now the reason shapes have a Style 1 and a Style 2 is because you will frequently want to make your fill settings and stroke settings separately. For example, I'll set up a style for the fill color of the skin here, and I just want it to include the fill, so I'll uncheck everything else. Then I'll make another style for the stroke color. Then for a case like the mouth, I can still give it the skin color for the strokes and make the interior color whatever I want. So that's it for the style palette for now. Next, we're going to look at one final way you can work with color in MoHo, and that's making gradients using color points. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there. So we previously looked at the gradient effect that can be applied to a shape to create a color gradient. However, this is somewhat limited if the shape is going to be animated. If you have a shape that's changing shape over the course of its animation, the gradient effect doesn't automatically change with it. You would have to animate the gradient separately. In this lesson, we're going to look at a feature called color points. That lets you achieve a similar gradient effect, but in a way that gives you more control, though it does take more work to set up. If you have a shape, you can select a point or group of points, and then switch to the color point tool over here. Then the toolbar up here associates a color with that point. And then that point will sort of radiate that color according to the strength setting here. You can typically lower the strength setting well below 1. Then that can blend with the original color of the shape. Or if you want, you can assign other colors to other points of the shape using the Color Points tool. And now when the shape changes, those points are still emitting their colors in their new positions. So let's look at how we might use this in a powerful way. So here we have a face, and let's add some color to the edges of the ears. First of all, I'm going to add an additional line to the ear that will give us more control. I'm going to use the Add Point tool to draw an additional line near the edge. But now I need to make sure this line is actually part of the ear shape. So I'm going to use the Delete Shape tool to delete the existing ear shape, and then select all those lines and use the Create Shape tool to make all those lines a single shape. I want it to have both a stroke and a fill. Now that just gave it the default colors of white and black, but fortunately in the advanced mode of the style palette, I can set the style back to the skin colors that I have saved. And it also put the stroke color on that new inner line, which I don't want, so I'm just going to use the Hide Edge tool to hide the stroke on that inner line. Now I'm going to select the outer points of the ear and save that selection as a group with a name just in case. And now with the Color Points tool, I'll give a warmer color to those points. And I think I'm also going to lower the color strength on those points. Then the advantage of this inner line is that since these points don't have a color point color, we can move them to adjust how far the color extends from the edges. If the color is looking blotchy, you can add additional points with the Add Points tool. If it's between two color points, it will automatically have the same color point value. Then I'll make a reference layer and flip it to make the other ear. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you might use color points. You could use this to add shadows or highlights as well, either along the edge or an invisible inner line. Next, we're going to look at one more important technique we'll be using in making our artwork, and that's masks. We'll look at that in the next video. I'll see you there. One last technique I wanted to make sure you're familiar with is masking. Now, masks in MoHo work differently than in other programs you might be familiar with, so it warrants its own video. Let's start with the most basic example. I'm going to add an image layer and import an image, and we're going to make a mask that reveals a portion of this image. So I'll make a vector layer, and I'm going to call it mask, and then I'll draw a circle on it. Next, we need to put whatever you want to mask and the mask itself in a group together. So I'll make a group and put our two layers inside it. You want your mask at the bottom. Now in the layer settings for the group, we go to the masking tab and set it to hide all. So layers that we've set to get masked will get hidden by default, and the mask layer will reveal them. Now in this case it correctly understood what I was trying to get it to do, but just in case it doesn't work for you, let's go into the settings for the layers and see what they need to be set to make this work right. In the settings for the image layer on the masking tab, you want that to mask this layer. And then on the settings for the mask layer on the masking tab, we want this to add to the mask. So now if we reposition or animate the mask, it's going to reveal the image that's set to be masked. You can also have multiple layers adding to the mask. I can make another vector layer with another shape on it, and I can set that to add to the mask too. So you can have separate elements that you can animate separately, both contributing to the masking effect. You can also make your mask work the opposite way. You would set the mask setting on the group to reveal all, and then the setting on the mask layers to subtract from mask. So now the mask layers hide instead of reveal. Next, let's look at a practical example of how you'll frequently use masks, and that's to do eyes. So here we've got the three layers for the eye base, which is the whites, the iris, and the highlight over top. So we want to be able to move the iris around without it going outside the eyeball. So let's select all these and make that a group. Then we'll go into the group and turn on masking. We want it set to hide all. Then we need to make sure the layers have the right settings. We want the highlight and iris to be masked while the eye base adds to the mask. So now we can move the iris around and it never goes outside the eye base layer. but you'll notice it's going over top of the stroke around the eye base. But there's an easy way to fix that. So let's go to the mask settings and check the exclude strokes option. Then it will only use the visible part of the fill to do the masking. So now when I move the iris around, it looks more like how we want. Also, while we're here, this is a case where we want the artwork for the mask itself to be visible, because it's the whites of the eyes. But if you wanted to, you could also set it to add to the mask, but make the mask invisible. And that might be what you want for a different situation. So that's the basics of masking. There's a bunch of ways we'll use that later on when we get to rigging a character. To prepare us for that, we need to get familiar with the various features we'll use for rigging an animation. We'll do that in the next set of videos. I'll see you there.